Well, good morning again, brethren, and with our TV up here close to where I'm normally walking, if I'm trying to get up here, I need to be sure not to run my head into it. But I can tell who set this all up. It was Brad. Because Brad's been having this speaker blast in his ear for months. And so now he's got it over there. So anyway, wonderful to see all of you, and it's delightful to be able to drive up here. I got to drive in the rain most of the way up here. It was 37 degrees when I left home. So it was cool last night. I think next Sabbath's supposed to be below freezing at night. So it's going to be starting to get colder, but we've got some fall days here, I think, before we get to the snowy winter that we will eventually have. Well, I know all of us are familiar with the time that we live in, November, December, and the usual holiday craze that we know is going to be at the end of every year. We get through the Feast of Tabernacles, we conclude the Holy Days of God, and then before we get to the Passover, we've got all kinds of holidays, most of which are not godly, most of which have nothing to do with God or with what God wants us to do. And it seems to me that it's this way almost every year, but even more so this year. It seems to be even crazier, more significant. And certainly, you know, if you watch the advertising at all, we've had a month or 2 months of Halloween being advertised over and over again. And of course, I don't know why there was a focus on the Day of the Dead, at least in Kansas City. And that was something you see all the time on commercials and advertising. And yet in thinking about that, which I know is connected with All Saints Day and whatever the Catholic Church promotes, but I was also thinking that, you know, trying to memorialize those who have died, or trying to think back, you know, to their lives, or maybe that thinking they're still alive. That just is a part of the immortal soul concept. That, well, you don't really die. You know, you're not really dead. And of course, all of us realize that the Bible tells us when the dead die, they're dead. You know, they are going to be buried or cremated or whatever, maybe completely lost as far as their remains, but they're going to be resurrected one day. But in the meantime, death is death. And Satan doesn't want people to realize that. He doesn't want, the speaker in Kansas City a month or so ago, you know, pointed out in Genesis 3 that, you know, the whole idea of death was completely foreign to Adam and Eve. What's this death? You will not surely die. What do you mean die? We just know life. We don't know what it is to be dead. And yet God's Word, of course, tells us that, you know, it is something we should certainly understand. We can't think about it in the way that people kind of rationalize and think about, well, you're not really dead. You know, you just kind of pass away from one existence to another. Well, no, you're dead. And so it's important well, I was talking about Halloween. Anyway, you know, we've got Halloween, and of course, immediately, well, once you get through October 31st, then, what are all the commercials about? They're all about Christmas. You know, there's already ads everywhere about Christmas, and they'll be promoting gift giving and all the things that will be in connection with that. And like I was saying, I think this year seems even more significant because of this election that we were just talking about earlier. The political election consuming people's time, their thoughts, their energy, And, even though we know Election Day is next Tuesday, it won't be over then. It won't be over at all. They'll be arguing about who won and who lost endlessly, probably for months, until they finally, come up with some solution. But in light of all of that, when do people have time to truly observe a day of Thanksgiving? The focus is certainly not on Thanksgiving Day or on what it is that the people here in this country, the United States, we should be grateful for. We have much, much to be thankful for. And yet most people, it's a day when maybe you get together with family, certainly, eating and drinking are the focus of that. And yet, I would say, has Thanksgiving Day as a national holiday, has Thanksgiving become the forgotten holiday? That would be, I guess, the title. Has Thanksgiving become the forgotten holiday? Are people so consumed with the distractions that they can't even truly understand or appreciate the blessings that God has showered on this land? All of us come and go. We have relatively safe places to live. We live in Missouri, of course, or you do. I live in Kansas, and I don't know. I hope we don't mess up the hours to where I don't even know what time it is. I can't even figure it out. But nonetheless, I just figured that if I started watching the Chiefs tomorrow at the wrong time, something's really messed up. So anyway, it's not my purpose to deal with the national holiday of Thanksgiving today. That's something we often do go over. But I do want us to consider and make a conscious effort to count our blessings that God has provided. Because, and we used to have a song in our hymnal, that's an old hymn really, Count Your Blessings. It actually has much good information in it, although, and I know we don't have it in our hymnal right now, we used to have in the Worldwide Church of God hymnal, it was there, but it was modified. One of the stanzas wasn't there because it talks about going to heaven, and so that was just deleted. Anyway, the verses that have significant meaning, talk about counting your blessing and enumerating them, thinking about them in a way that is meaningful to you and to your family and to your brethren. That's something I want to encourage all of us to do. The great God who put men on the earth began to work through Abraham. We see that in Genesis 12. And actually, I will mention Genesis is a book we don't often go over all the time. In many ways, we probably think, well, most everybody knows quite a bit about what it's a very important to understand Genesis, because it's actually the book of beginnings. It's the book of many beginnings, not just mankind, but how God would deal with the flood, and Noah, how he would deal then beginning with Abraham, actually from chapter 12 to the end. It's all dealing with Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob, children, and primarily Joseph. And again, I know all of you are pretty familiar with that. We have published, the Church of God published a booklet, United States and British Commonwealth and Prophecy. I'm sure all of us read through that at a given point in our exposure. I don't know if our young people have. I hope you have at least been told about it, because it is important. It's important to realize that the descendants of Abraham, the descendants of Israel, were given incredible blessing and promise from God that he would bring to pass. Now, did he do that through the whole history of the Old Testament, or did he do that during the time when Jesus was on earth? Or did he ultimately fulfill this in the last 200 or 300 years? See, the time when all of us have been living. We've lived 50, 60, 70, 80 or more years. We've lived in the best time the world has experienced, at least for our land, because this country is incredibly blessed. I want us to go back to Genesis 48 and Genesis 49, because these verses explain how it is that Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, Jacob was blessing his 12 sons and in particular Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And actually chapter 48 details this, and you can read through this. I'm going to read through a part of it at least. But in Genesis 48 you see Joseph bringing his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to his father Jacob, and he was going to bless him. Now again, you think, well, what was this blessing about? How important was it? How significant is it? Well, as we read through this, I think you will see this was far more than just an average blessing. This was far more than just hoping his descendants would have good lives and benefit them. This was for a time way beyond when this is occurring here in Genesis 48. Let's start in Genesis 48, verse 15. Starting in verse 15, it says, he, talking about Jacob, the one who would be named Israel, Jacob blessed Joseph. And so in this case, specific blessing was going to be poured upon Joseph. And he says, the God, and so here, who's going to be doing the blessing? Who's going to provide the blessing for Joseph and for his children? The God before whom my ancestors Abraham and Isaac walked. The God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. The angel who has redeemed me from all harm. So here he's talking about, who is going to provide a blessing? Well, the Creator God, the God who set men on the earth for a purpose, the God who rules over all world affairs, who is over, what happens and what doesn't, and of course he's going to bring out the outcome that he wants. In this case, he says the God who was the God of my father Abraham and Isaac, the one who was my shepherd, the one who was always, you think about Psalm 23, and of course David was writing this and saying, the Lord is my shepherd. Is my shepherd. See, that's what all of us want. We want that individually. I seek that each day, that God will and that Christ will look after and watch over and comfort and guide and care for me. But see, this was how it was that Jacob looked at. He had interacted with God. He had interacted with the Lord of the Old Testament, the one who was the Word prior to that, the one who became Jesus Christ, the Son of God, only 2,000 years ago, and the one who's going to bring to pass what he says. It's God, he says in verse 16, in them, talking about blessing the boys, and here he had Ephraim and Manasseh before him, in them let my name, the name of Israel, be perpetuated, in the name of my ancestors Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude on the earth. Now, you can say, well, when did that happen? Well, it was only partially occurring over a lengthy period of time, and there were always ups and downs as far as this family that God would deal through. But ultimately, there was going to be a great blessing and a great multitude of people that would be Israelite. Again, people don't think hardly in these terms at all today, unless they read the Bible and want to really understand something about it. Let's look in verse 17. See, Joseph has his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, before his father, Jacob. In verse 17, when Joseph saw that his father had his right hand on Ephraim, it displeased him, and so he tried to change it. And yet Jacob said, verse 19, his father, Jacob, refused and said, I know, my son, I know. And so he says, he, talking about Manasseh, also shall become a people, and he shall become a great nation. He goes on to say, nevertheless, his younger brother, talking about Ephraim, shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations, or a commonwealth of nations. And so he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will invoke blessings, saying, God, make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. See, now, we read that today, and we read it in the context of our understanding of the world we live in. And yet, here in the last 250 years for the United States, and then the century or two before that in England, this actually came to pass. It came to pass that a great commonwealth of nations would rise, and that has been the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, as it had its Commonwealth nations. Whenever you're there at Buckingham Palace, they've got the Canada Gate and the Australia Gate and the South Africa Gate. They had at one time influence around the world. That was, of course, before any of us were alive, before any of us were aware of the incredible prominence that the great nation here in the last 250 years, the great nation of the United States of America would rise and would become this great nation kind of after the great Commonwealth of Nations had risen and, of course, in a sense, kind of declined. Of course, we're in a state of decline today. We see that in so many different ways. And yet, this blessing was described further. If we jump over, well, let me go ahead and read. So he put Ephraim, this is in verse 20, he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. And then Jacob, Israel said to Joseph, I'm about to die. So it wasn't going to be that Joseph was going to bring this about or that Jacob would bring it about, but he says, God will be with you, and he will bring you again to the land of your ancestors. And I now give to you one portion more than to your brothers, the portion that I took from the hand of the Amorites. And so here he in a sense set the people who would descend from Joseph, the people of Ephraim and Manasseh, he gave them a greater portion. Whenever you read here in the next chapter, here in chapter 49, you see all of the different sons of Jacob were blessed. They were blessed, and actually you see characteristics that are described that we kind of look at the nations today, and we can see some of those clearly and see some others not so clearly. But we believe that those nations or those peoples are scattered around in a lot of different nations around the world, and primarily in Europe and here in this country, or in some of the more extended areas in Australia or South Africa. And we see them being blessed, and yet you find a greater blessing upon Joseph, upon his sons, Ephraim being a commonwealth of nations, and Manasseh being this great nation. Let's jump over to verse 22. in chapter 49, speaking of the blessings to the people of Joseph, in verse 22, Joseph will be a fruitful bough, a fruitful bough by a spring, and his branches run over the walls. Talking about him being an expanding and a growing number of people, as certainly the United States, of course, grew out of the people primarily coming from England in the original colonies. And he says in verse 23, the archers fiercely attack him. They shoot at him and press his hand, yet his bow remains taut, and his arm is made agile. How? How is it that Joseph has gained such prominence? Well, by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the name of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, by the God of your father, who will help you, by the Almighty, who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lie beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of your father are stronger than the blessings of the eternal mountains, the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph, on the brow of him who is set apart from his brethren. See, all of the sons of Israel in some ways were blessed here. It describes those blessings, some of them greater, some of them lesser. But to Joseph, to the descendants of Joseph, ultimately God would bring about, the world that we live in today. And particularly, we see this with World War II. And again, many of you are young enough where World War II and World War II certainly was even before me, before I was born. And yet we can see, the incredible blessing and dominance and dynamic power that the United States had, not only then, but since then, over several decades. And now, again, we're pretty much in decline. So, it's been in our lifetime that these blessings can most fully be understood. When you look back at history, what great commonwealth of nations could fill that description? What great nation, greater than the United States, would fulfill that in our knowledge, in our awareness? That's what we see in that God has written this long ago. He has brought this about, and it's only in these last 50 years, 20 years here into this century and 30, 40 years before that, the last 50 years, that this has been possible, that it's been visible, that it's actually been revealed by God for people to understand. And all of us really are greatly blessed to understand that. That's a part of the teaching that we have from the Bible that we understand and appreciate, and yet many people, would dismiss that altogether. They wouldn't even think that that is accurate. They don't even believe it. But of course, we do. And so I think we should ask ourselves, are we truly blessed, or are we truly thankful for these blessings that God has poured out upon us, upon the people of Joseph, upon the people of Manasseh directly, on this country? I would say, and as we think about being a thankful people, we have many physical blessings that we could enumerate. And as I mentioned, we should count those blessings one by one. We've got physical blessings, we've got spiritual blessings when we think about God drawing us into the church of God. And there's another blessing that we need to be grateful for, but we often tend not to be, and that's even for the trials that we go through. We don't want trials. We don't like trials. Those are very inconvenient, often hurtful. We don't like to be tested. And yet, that's also something we can be thankful for. So those are the three things I'm going to mention here. Physical blessings, spiritual blessings, and even the blessing of trials. the blessing that God says trials are. So first of all, let's read chapter 6. We can look at this pretty much in the nation of Israel, as Deuteronomy was written by Moses toward the end of the 40 years in the wilderness as they were approaching going into the promised land. And yet it says, as they were preparing to go into the promised land, in verse 10 of Deuteronomy 6, when the Lord your God has brought you into the land that He swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you that land, a land with fine large cities that you didn't build, houses filled with all sorts of goods that you didn't fill, hewn cisterns that you didn't hew, vineyards and olive groves that you didn't plant, and when you have eaten your fill, what does verse 12 point out? Verse 12 says, take care. Take care that you do not forget who brought all of this to pass. See, now that was clearly directed to them, that as they go into the promised land and are given the abundance of that land flowing with milk and honey, that was, the promise that God would give them. But He says, when you go in there and you receive all this stuff, all these blessings, don't forget that it was the Lord who brought that about. And He brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And you should fear and then serve Him. See, this is exactly what we find in our nation today. Since they don't really fully understand the blessings that God has provided for this nation and where all of us live, as they're told not to forget. If we jump over a page over here to chapter 8, what is it that they are told? Deuteronomy chapter 8 is actually a wonderful chapter because in many ways it explains how it is that the Israelites had gone through. They were brought out of Egypt. They were in the wilderness because they were contrary and disobedient and didn't honor the one who brought them out. But in verse 11, chapter 8, verse 11, take care that you do not forget the Lord your God. See, unfortunately, this is kind of the state of the world or the state of the country that we're in. People have forgotten. If they ever knew, they've certainly forgotten that God is the one who has provided the great blessings. Here in verse 11, take care that you don't forget the Lord your God by failing to keep His commandments, His ordinances, and His statutes, which I'm commanding you today. If we drop down to verse 12, when you've eaten your fill, you build the houses and live in them. When your herds and flocks have multiplied, your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then do not exalt yourself, in verse 14, forgetting the Lord your God who brought you out of the land, out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, who led you through great and terrible wilderness and a vast wasteland. But He did this to humble you, in verse 16. And verse 17, do not say to yourself, my power and the might of my own hand has gotten me this wealth. But in verse 18, remember, the Lord your God has power to get wealth, so that you may confirm His covenant that He swore to your ancestors, as He is doing today. See, they were even warned. The Israelites, as they were going into the promised land, they're going to be given abundance. They're going to be given things that they didn't really do themselves. Realize that all of this wealth, all of this prosperity, all of this abundance has not come because of you. It's come because of God. And that again is something that most people in this land, they don't even recognize. They don't acknowledge. They think it's owned by my power or by my might. That's not what it says. It says God is the one who provides your blessing. And so, as I did mention to you, we need to count our blessings. Count our blessings, and we can, if you break it down to just simple things, As I travel up here most every week, I'm thankful for the good road, an absolutely good road, and a decent car, and all of the protection that God provides, the safety, and yeah, we're building a new bridge over the Missouri River out here on I-70. I'm sure there's reasons for that, but maybe the other one was declining to the point where they needed it. They needed to have a new bridge, but they don't want this good road, which connects much of the east to the west. They don't want that broken down. But see, we've got ability to do that. I marvel at what are they doing over there, trying to build this new bridge on the north side of the old bridge. I don't know exactly how it'll completely be done and finished, but it's just amazing that you can actually even do that. And you can make these kind of changes or preparation in the abundant land that we live in. Now, whether or not we can get gas to run trucks back and forth or diesel back and forth, that's another question. That's a problem that we struggle with because we, so in kind of crazily can't figure out how to even enjoy the benefits and the abundance that God has given us. But anyway, certainly this country, and clearly all of us, with the abundance that we are just simply used to. We're just simply used to. The kids here, you young people, you're just used to really good stuff. You're really, your parents are wealthy. Well, maybe not that wealthy. Not as wealthy as many in this country. I mean, there are people who are really, really wealthy in this country. Not always because of godly activity, some of which by completely corrupt activity. But the Bible also talks about that. The wicked prosper. God doesn't slash them. He doesn't smash them. He will eventually get their attention. But that's something that we need to think about, that that we live in an abundance. I think about my life, and I grew up in an incredible setting, a farm setting, certainly a setting that I liked and loved, and my family was very loving. I was greatly blessed. And then when I left Coyle, Oklahoma, when I was 18, I was blessed even more because I went to Ambassador College, and from then have been a part of the Church of God ever since. And so that starts going into the second part of the spiritual blessings. But all of us can enumerate, thinking of where most of you live. I pretty well know where most of you live. We live in abundance. We live in a land that is greatly blessed. And yet, we need to think about that, especially as we get attention crowded out, even around the time of Thanksgiving holiday. We don't want to neglect knowing what we just read in Genesis 48 and 49, that was what God intended. That's what He planned that would come to pass here toward the end of the age. And of course, we know we're living in that time. Let's think about our spiritual blessings as well. In Luke chapter 10, verse 21, you see that God provides us a calling. He provides us understanding of His Word. See, many of us were exposed to the Word of God maybe, from the time we were born. Many of us had at least an exposure to some kind of a church teaching, a Bible instruction. Now, we mostly all came to see, well, what we were taught wasn't exactly correct. It was wrong. It was not the truth. But then we've come to understand the truth because of what we read in verse 21, where Jesus says, I thank you, Father, that you have hidden these things. He was talking about the knowledge and mystery of the kingdom of God. I thank you, Father, you've hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and you've revealed them to infants. For so it was well-pleasing in your sight. Verse 22, no one knows who the Son is except the Father, or who the Father is except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. But blessed are the eyes that see what you see, and that spiritual vision, that spiritual hearing are gifts from the Creator God. And see, all of us, even verse 22 is not something that people generally think about or believe, that the Father would have to draw us to Jesus Christ. And as we come to understand what Jesus teaches and what He says and what He reveals about the Father, we come to more closely understand what He's doing, how He's growing a divine family, how He wants us as children to become His sons and His daughters. See, Paul talks about this here in Ephesians chapter 1. Let's read this particular verse. Ephesians chapter 1, he says in verse 3, actually in verse 2, he says, grace be to you. He was speaking to the church congregation there in Ephesus. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, just as He chose us in Christ before the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless before Him in love. So it says He chose those members of the church. He chose those who were going to be a part of the congregation in Ephesus. It says in verse 5, He destined us for adoption as His children through Jesus Christ, according to the good pleasure of His will, to the praise of His glorious grace that He freely bestowed on us in the Beloved. Now that's a pretty complex sentence, and a great deal of information is revealed there. But see, it's talking about the great spiritual blessing that all of us have in understanding God's purpose for our lives. And we don't want to take that for granted. We know that we're obeying God. We're obeying God because we want to avoid sin. We don't want to continue to live in sin, but we want to respect God. We want to honor Him. We want to glorify Him in our lives. And what He tells us to do is simply obeying His law and being in subjection to Him. See, that's what you find that in Romans it describes. The carnal mind, the natural mind of man, is in opposition to God. It's in hostility or enmity are the words that are used in the King James. And we are subject. We're subject to His law. It actually goes ahead to say that the natural mind of man is not subject to the law of God. And so we want to pray that we will be. We will choose to be in subjection to His law and in submission to our head, and that we would surrender our will to the will of God. Those are all spiritual blessings that we are able to benefit from. But these are also blessings that we ought to thank God for. Let's go on to James chapter 2. See, I want to read this one verse in James chapter 2. It's talking about, James is giving instruction about a number of different things, and there are a lot of different almost kind of proverb-like things written in the book of James. And yet here in chapter 2, he's talking about partiality and favoritism and people who are easily misled or they are deceived by bribes. Those are a part of what he's mentioning. But he says in verse 5, listen, brethren, listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be the heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him. See, that's actually just a very simple verse, but it talks about how that we are the weak of the world, yes. We don't have all of the influence or all of the power, but we do have God's choosing, God's calling, God drawing us. And so we never want to neglect how it is that God has chosen to work in our lives. He's chosen us and to set us on a path that is out of the ordinary, yes. We don't fit into the kind of the normal pattern of everything going on around us in this world. But there's a reason that we do that. We do that because we're thankful for what God has done. He started that at some point. Maybe we grew up in it. Or maybe it was something that God more dramatically. Growing up in it doesn't always seem as dramatic as a calling from God. As I think back in my life, I was glad to know at age 17 that there actually was a purpose in life. I was glad to know, because I was really puzzled because I didn't see any real reason to do any of the things that people just commonly do. I didn't see that. And yet I know that that was simply God working in my life to point me in the right direction. Now, clearly I had to try to follow that and clearly had to change almost everything that needed to be changed in my life. Almost everything needed to be changed. And yet God starts us at a beginning point and He wants us to continue. He wants us to be diligent. He wants us to be enduring unto the end. So we have a great many physical blessings to enumerate, to count one by one. We have spiritual blessings that are extraordinary, maybe beyond even our understanding. And yet we need to enumerate those. We need to think about, well, how is it that God worked in my life? How is it that He has provided understanding of things? And we can read the Bible today. You read the Bible today with more understanding than you did 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 40 years ago. We read it at that time, many of us, and we understood some of it, but we can understand it better today, not so much because of us, but because of God, because of Him continually causing us to grow and to develop. And so that leads to the third thing I mentioned, and this is here on the same page here in the book of James, that we not only want to be considering our physical blessings, our spiritual blessings, but even realizing that here in James chapter 1, we're told we need to be thankful for our trials. We don't like to be sick. We don't like to have financial difficulties. We don't like to have difficulty with other people. But what does he tell us here in James chapter 1? James chapter 1 verse 2, he says, "Brethren, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy. Count it all joy," is what the King James says. Whenever you face trials of any kind, count it all joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces patience. It produces endurance, and let patience have its full effect so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. I'm not sure exactly why James started out this little book with that statement, but that's something that's often very, very hard to do. To count it all joy, to be thankful that God allows us to go through trials. But He tells us because we understand that He wants us to grow in His nature. He wants us to grow in His character. And that's His purpose in allowing us even to go through. Now, some of it we might even bring on ourselves by our decisions, but He allows that too. And He gives us a way to recover. He gives us a way to improve, and He tells us to count it all joy. See, why is it? Why is it that that's an important aspect of our thanksgiving? See, we want to be thankful for what God says in a lot of different places. It tells us to be thankful. And of course, there's a lot of examples of people who were not thankful. You know, you see the example of the lepers coming to Jesus. 10 of them came, and only one of them came back and thanked Him for what He had just done for them in an incredible healing. But see, many of us, you know, we go through trials, and of course, we labor through those trials. But He wants us, you know, to learn to look at that trial as a benefit. You know, why is it that God tells us this? Well, first of all, we recognize that there is value. There is spiritual growth going on. That's the first thing that we realize. That's how can we be joyful even going through a trial? Well, we realize what God's doing. We realize that there is value to the trial and value to the spiritual growth. And then secondly, another thing that adds to even joying in trials and being thankful that we go through trials is that we become content. We become content with God's will in our lives. See, in this country today, there are a lot of people who are not content. A lot of people that are discouraged, that are depressed, that are, and not to say that we don't get discouraged or down or depressed at times, because that does happen. But see, there are a lot of people who are very frustrated about what's going on around the world, what's going on in our country. And yet part of it is, you know, they don't have a framework for understanding, well, trials are to benefit us. Trials are for our growth. And trials also help us, it gives us a contentment. See, I think we could safely say that nothing turns us into bitter, selfish, dissatisfied people more quickly than a lack of thankfulness, an ungrateful heart. When people are not grateful, you know, then they're going to be upset. They're going to be distressed. And see, nothing will do more to restore contentment and joy of salvation than a true spirit of thankfulness. And that's what I encourage all of us to appreciate, to think about. You know, we know, Thanksgiving Day will be in a few weeks from now, but we need to be thankful for our physical blessings, our spiritual blessings, maybe even more so, but then also even for the contentment that God gives us in knowing that even the trials we endure are for a purpose. You know, I think that, if we think in that way, then we will find that we are able to be at peace. We've talked about how that even Daniel was told that, well, many are going to be, they're going to be cleansed, they're going to be refined, they're going to be purified. That was talking about the saints, the people of God. That's going to happen. God's going to allow that. And so we need to be thankful when God allows us to go through that. And, we want to do that knowing that when you think of the blessing that God gave to Moses to give to Aaron for Israel, it says, may the Lord bless you, and may the Lord keep you, and may He turn His face toward you and give you His grace, and let His countenance be upon you, and let His peace be upon you. When you think about, there's 6 things there that are mentioned. When you think about all those, that's exactly what every one of us need. That's in number 6, if you want to look it up. But that's exactly what we need. And that's exactly what, this country does not have. They do not have that type of contentment or peace And so, they can continue to disobey God and then reap the penalty of disobedience. But for all of us, we want to simply be different than what the Israelites were. They were told, don't forget God. Don't forget that your blessings come from God. And certainly for all of us, don't forget, that God has set us on a path that's, you could describe it as the joy of the path of salvation, because that's what He set us on, and that He allows trials so that we will learn to be content as we accept His will in our lives. So let's truly not be forgetful, but to clearly thank our great God for the many blessings He has given us.